By 1973, the muscle car funeral had begun at full force. However, Pontiac showed up late with the last true muscle car. That late arrival came in the form of the 1973 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Super Duty 455. The industry had already changed. Insurance companies were punishing high-horsepower cars with steep premiums. The 1970 Clean Air Act forced compression ratios down. Horsepower ratings switched from gross to net, and numbers across the board suddenly looked smaller. Chevrolet, Ford, and Dodge were detuning engines just to survive new emissions rules. Performance ads grew quieter. The wild peak years of 1968 to 1970 were over. And then Pontiac approved the Super Duty 455. On the surface, it seemed like just another version of the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, with the same second-generation F-body shape, the same long hood and short rear deck, and the same aggressive stance. It also had 310 horsepower, which frankly was serious for the time, because many competing performance cars had dropped to barely 250 horsepower. By 1973, muscle car sales were already falling. High insurance rates scared younger buyers away, fuel prices were climbing, and the oil crisis would erupt later that year. Corporate pressure inside General Motors leaned toward efficiency and compliance, not rebellion. Building a heavy-duty 455 cubic inch engine with forged internals was expensive, especially when production projections were low. And they were low. Only around 252 Super Duty Trans Ams were built for 1973. That is not a volume strategy, that is a statement. Pontiac knew this engine would not define the sales charts, it defined the brand. The visual presence backed it up. Archival footage shows the shaker hood scoop trembling at an idle bolted directly to the air cleaner so it moves with engine vibration. When the throttle opens, the scoop shifts slightly, feeding cold air into a quadrajet carburetor. It is mechanical and visible. No fake vents, no decorative scoops. What you see is connected to what you hear. Road tests from the era confirm it was not just noise. Independent magazine testing recorded quarter-mile times in the low 14-second range at roughly 100 miles per hour. 0 to 60 miles per hour could fall into the mid-5-second range under ideal conditions. In a year when many performance cars struggled to break 15 seconds, the Super Duty felt alive. But the real tension was not in its acceleration times. It was in the timing of its existence. Pontiac identity had long been tied to performance. The GTO helped launch the muscle era. The Firebird carried that image forward. Abandoning performance entirely would have meant surrendering what made Pontiac distinct inside General Motors. The Super Duty 455 was not just about speed. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. Here is the turn. Pontiac did not just preserve an old engine formula. It overbuilt that engine during the collapse of the very segment it belonged to. While other divisions were softening and shrinking, Pontiac reinforced and certified a true 455 cubic inch performance engine in an emissions-constrained world. This was a deliberate, overbuilt statement. Some argue the muscle era died in 1970 and that everything after was watered down. That view ignores context. Under the new net rating system, 310 horsepower in 1973 represented real strength. More importantly, it represented intent. This wasn't nostalgia, it wasn't a comeback, it was resistance, cast in iron and bolted together with forged steel. The funeral had begun. Pontiac just refused to lower the volume. What Pontiac released into the world in 1973 was more than a badge package. It was a machine you could measure, drive, and compare against everything else that survived the early 70s. Look under the hood of a Super Duty Trans Am today, and the engineering choices are still visible. The SD455 block carried thicker bulkheads around the main bearings. It used 4-bolt main caps instead of the standard 2-bolt setup found in many production engines. Forged connecting rods replaced cheaper cast pieces. The cylinder heads were round port designs derived from earlier high-performance Pontiac programs, but adapted for emissions-era durability. This wasn't marketing, it was metallurgy. On paper, the engine displaced 455 cubic inches with a 4.21-inch stroke. Compression was lowered compared to the wild 1970 engines, sitting around 8.4 to 1 to meet emissions requirements. Yet torque remained strong at 390 pound-feet. That mattered more than peak horsepower. In a 3,800-pound car, torque moved weight. Magazine road tests from 1973 and 1974 recorded quarter-mile times in the low 14-second range at roughly 100 miles per hour. 0 to 60 runs could dip into the mid-5-second range. Those numbers may not rival earlier gross-rated legends, but under net ratings and emissions limits, they were impressive. Visually, the car reinforced the message. The second-generation F-body platform gave it a wide, low stance. Overall width was just over 73 inches. A long hood stretched forward, interrupted by the functional shaker scoop. In period photos, you can see the scoop vibrating slightly at idle, directly connected to the air cleaner assembly. Press the throttle and it shifts with engine movement. It is mechanical and honest. Compare it to competitors from the same year and the contrast sharpens. Many 1973 performance models from other brands had already retreated below 280 net horsepower. Some were closer to 250. Insurance rates pushed buyers away from big engines. Emissions tuning softened throttle response. Pontiac did not escape those forces, but it leaned against them. Here is the detail that defines the car. The Super Duty program was approved, knowing it would not last long. The oil crisis erupted in late 1973. Fuel lines formed across the country. Public sentiment shifted almost overnight toward efficiency. Large displacement engines became harder to justify. Pontiac continued the Super Duty into 1974, producing around 943 units that year. But regulatory pressure tightened further. Catalytic converters were coming, compression ratios stayed low, the window for big cube muscle was closing fast. And yet the engine remained overbuilt relative to its rating. The reinforced block and forged internals were more robust than strictly necessary for 310 net horsepower. Interviews with former Pontiac engineers suggest pride played a role. They wanted one car that proved the brand still knew how to build strength, even as the market shrank. Two facts people often misunderstand deserve correction. First, the Super Duty was not just graphics and a hood decal. The internal components and block casting were unique. Second, judging it by gross horsepower standards misses the point. After 1971, all manufacturers used net ratings. Within that framework, the SD455 was among the strongest available in 1973. What this says about Pontiac is simple. Identity mattered enough to justify a low-volume, high-cost engine during the collapse of an era. It wasn't the fastest car ever built. It wasn't the most technologically advanced. But it was built when building it made little business sense. That is why many enthusiasts call it the last true muscle car. Not because nothing powerful came later, but because it was one of the final, large displacement, carbureted iron block engines developed before the industry fully pivoted to a different philosophy. If this car brings back memories of raw exhaust notes, heavy steering, and the feeling of torque pushing you back in the seat, share that memory in the comments. Give this video a like and subscribe. Thanks for the support.